Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's online event, which is jointly hosted by the Department of Anthropology and the International Inequalities Institute. I'm Francisco Ferreira, and I'll be the chair this evening. In today's event, which is entitled The Dawn of Everything, David Wengrow will be in conversation with Alpa Shah about his new book, co-authored with the late David Graeber, which is called The Dawn of Everything: New History of Humanity. Before introducing our speakers, let me say a few words about the author who's not with us today, about David Graeber. Graeber was an anthropologist and a very influential public thinker who tackled a number of big and important topics. From his best-selling book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, to his analysis of bullshit jobs, he really helped shape the conversation. LSE was fortunate to have him as a professor here from 2013 until his premature death on the 2nd of September 2020, just over a year ago. And our community of scholars here is surely poorer without him. This event today actually marks the first in a series of events commemorating David Graeber's legacy. It's also the first public event on David's last book, which he completed with David Wengrow just before he died. The book, The Dawn of Everything: A New History of Humanity, will be out a week from yesterday, as I understand it, on the 19th of October, and it can be already pre-ordered now. And I think there'll be a link on the chat for you to do that. Now, from next week till the end of the term, the anthropology department will be hosting a series of seminars every Friday morning with two world-leading anthropologists discussing one of David's key texts in each seminar. These are curated and chaired by Alpa herself, who is one of our panelists today. And she says everyone's welcome to them. I think there's a link also in the chat for those. I'd like to ask you now, if we could, to please have a minute's silence out of respect for David before I introduce our speakers. Thank you very much for that. Now, I'm delighted that we have today David Wengrow, who's a British archaeologist and a professor of comparative archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology at University College London, and my colleague Alpa Shah, who is a professor at the Department of Anthropology here at LSE, and also a convener of the Global Economies of Care research theme at the International Inequalities Institute, which I chair. The two speakers have distinguished careers and multiple achievements, and if I were to describe their CVs, we would take too long. So I'll just leave the introduction at that. I'll turn to them in a moment. Let me just say the event will run for an hour and a half, or an hour and 25 minutes from now until 7:30 p.m. London time. Our speakers will have a conversation for about 45 to 50 minutes. And then, of course, as usual, there'll be a chance for you all to ask questions, for the audience to pose questions in the final 30 minutes of the event. We ask that you please do so using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. And please state your affiliation and name when you do that. Our next public event, just to say, to be held here at the III, is going to be called Social Policy, a Critical and Intersectional Analysis. And it'll take place next Thursday, the 21st of October at 6 p.m. There's more information at the III website. Finally, if you're, we do have BSL interpretation, as you can see, and if you're using that and you'd like to pin the interpreter, you could do that so that you don't lose them as the screens move around. For now, I just want to hand over to Alpa and David, and I hope you'll enjoy the event. Thanks very much. Over to you, Alpa.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Chico, for this introduction and for sharing our event today. It's very hard to come to terms with the fact that we are doing this without David Graeber, but also at the same time quite amazing that we're here at all. So many things that could have derailed the dawn of everything. Over the last few years, I had seen various parts of the manuscript as it developed, but it was on August the 12th last year that I got an email with the entire script from David Graeber. He said, so here it is, actually, I'm in Berlin, but only maybe 3/5 better. Honestly, can't figure this thing out. How about yourself? David was clearly very sick at the time and had been for a while, complaining about a soapy taste in his mouth, pins and needles, feelings in his hands and his feet. But none of us knew that within a few weeks he would be gone. Looking back now, I wonder whether he knew or he had some idea of what was to come. He was clearly quite worried. I guess, we'll never know. But so characteristic of David, David being David, he made sure he would leave us with a parting gift. A gift which is full of life, which transcends our own mortality, that gives us new life. A gift that he has been gestating with David Wengrow over the last decade. David Wengrow, I remember how excited David was, when he first met you. It was more than a decade ago. It was a cold February night, and he said, Alpa, come, you've really got to come. You've got to come and meet David Wengrow. And I said to him, David, come on, I should be hibernating right now. I was seeing myself as living out some of the seasonality arguments that are made in the dawn of everything, and to which we will return later today. But it was David's birthday, so I traipsed off to Notting Hill, and meet we did. Over time, I understood the basis of David's excitement. I knew David, he had found the perfect partner to rethink our past in order to reimagine the future. A match that was going to wed archaeology and anthropology, that was going to give us infinitely new possibilities and hopefully new communities to rewrite history, to make history. David of Magic and David of Monsters, you became for me. I watched you play and grow the script. There were many things, many things in the way, but persevere you did, both of you in very different ways. I know David Wengrow, it's not been easy at all to carry this final script through to publication, nor be here today without David Graeber beside you. So thank you.
Thank you.
I see, I guess, my role today as being a kind of medium, who can hopefully help the two Davids draw out the monstrosity that has been cast of our past and the magic that has been hidden in plain sight. The dawn of everything really is a bomb full of gems, a bomb that blows up the evolutionary myths of the past that we have been fed and or reproduced, that human societies have grown, from hunter-gatherer bands progressively to tribes, chiefdoms, and states, or some other such teleological narrative, and that we're all the more sophisticated and civilized for this kind of trajectory. It's a bomb that explodes such myths and gives us new ones, more hopeful, more interesting, and more creative ones. And there are many little jewels all along the way. Those, I think, will have to be kept for the reader to discover, the reader who dives into this. It is big, the book, 700 pages, whose magic we will only be able to allude to in our brief conversation today. So yeah, without any further ado, we must begin. And begin we must with inequality, I think. This is an event that's hosted by the Anthropology Department and the International Inequalities Institute. And, you know, all those years ago, when you began, you were in fact going to write a book about inequality. What happened, David?
That's right. That's right. And thank you, Alpa. I mean, as I see it, I'm hoping you can hear me, by the way. It's always worth checking. I'm audible.
Good.
Yeah, as I see it, you're really just continuing the role that you always had with this book, because you are one of the very, very, very few people who was there right from the beginning, over 10 years ago, when it started to come into focus, and you've been there all along. So I'm really grateful and happy that we can talk about it now. You're absolutely right. Actually, initially what we planned to do was write a small book on the origins of social inequality. And over a decade later, we've ended up, as you say, writing quite a big book, which is explicitly not about the origins of social inequality. Actually, as you know, in one of the early chapters, we delve down into why anyone would have thought that was a particularly good question to ask in the first place, if you're looking at the broad sweep of human history, the origins of social inequality, because it it already seems to assume so much. It assumes there was a time before inequality, and then something happened to change that all. So the rest of history becomes a matter of trying to figure out what was that thing or things, which, as we discover along the way, is maybe not the best way of framing a broad approach to history. But I mean, actually what spurred us to write the book initially, I guess, was something much simpler, which is that we could see there was a lot of other literature out there in the world making assertions about this broad sweep of human history that were basically just wrong, or at least half a century out of date. Many of them also go on to reflect on the political implications of this wrong, out of date story, which turn out to be a bit worrying. For example, the idea that for most of our history, as you mentioned, our species lived in these tiny egalitarian bands of hunter-gatherers. That's how we originated. And then somehow we fell from this original state of grace into inequality.
Yeah.
It's not true, or that the origin of cities inevitably leads to the state. Again, it's not true, but there's some very deeply rooted assumptions there about how human societies develop.
Yeah, you have these, you know, at the foundations of the book, there are these two great men, you know, whose influential origins you tear down. There's, on the one hand, Rousseau, who claimed that we were once noble savages, and the other is Hobbes, you know, who is basically saying that we would all kill each other if we could, who said, if we're left to our own devices, make sure, you know,
Right.
make sure that life is nasty, brutish, and short. I mean, you know, you call the people who reproduce them Hobbesian hawks and Rousseauian doves. Tell us more about.
Well, it's true. We have a little bit of fun at the start of the book, slightly at the expense of the new versions of Hobbes and Rousseau. Remember, we're going back centuries here. I mean, both of these people, Hobbes wrote his book Leviathan, founding text of modern political theory, came out in 1651, I think, and then about a century later, 1754, Rousseau pens his second discourse, the Discourse on the Origins of Social Inequality. These are both state of nature theorists. What that means is they allow themselves to speculate about the original form of humanity. What were people like in the earliest days? And by the way, they're both completely upfront, especially Rousseau writes very clearly, you know, I'm making this up. This is not to be taken as fact. It's not science. It's not the basis for reconstructing anything that really happened. These are essentially parables, you know, they're fables. Although strangely, as you've mentioned, their fate in the hands of modern social scientists has been quite the opposite. They have been taken as the basis of real studies of how human societies evolved. But they do give us these two completely different juxtaposed notions of what that state of nature might have been. Actually, Rousseau's is much weirder than most people realize. We don't even start out in bands. Humanity is supposed to start out almost as a bunch of completely isolated individuals, like wandering through the forest, living off wild berries and resources, very few, if any, material possessions, but very happy in this state of complete sort of naivety. And then we take up farming, which brings along with it private property and a division of labor. And with the division of labor, this ushers in government to protect the property, and we know the rest of the story. And it's really all a parable, you know, it's meant to illustrate his famous point. Man is born free, but look, everywhere he's in chains. That's right. And Hobbes, as you mentioned, sort of does the opposite. But actually, whichever of these myths, let's just call them myths, that's what they are, whichever of these myths you go for, you kind of end up in the same place. So in the modern retellings, small means simple and egalitarian, if you like Rousseau. Big society means complex, but also hierarchical. So the obvious conclusion of the story then is that because there are, what, 8 billion people on the planet, we are effectively stuck. You know, we're fated to live with these really very radical levels of inequality, just as a sort of side effect of living in big, sophisticated societies. And yes, you know, we can fiddle around the edges and adjust tax regimes and that sort of thing, but structurally, there's not really much to be done, which, if you think about it at the present time, is quite a concerning conclusion. Fortunately, though, modern science, archaeology, anthropology show us that it's not true. Neither of the stories are in fact even remotely correct. In fact, they're both almost entirely wrong. And I assume we'll go into that. But maybe we should also talk about why we got it all so wrong in the first place.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I want to come on to you know, the evidence that you reveal, and but let's go before that to another person who you bring up, another man who's crucial to your story, right? And he's the wonderful Kandiarank, the great chief of the Wendat, you know, the French who called him a rat too. And I remember back in 2018, you know, when we were in the senior dining room at the LSE talking after the usual Friday morning anthropology seminar, at which we will pay tribute to David Graeber's work this term. You know, back then, David was like, he just couldn't stop himself talking with such excitement to anybody who was ready to listen about this indigenous statesman called Kandiarank, who was so utterly brilliant, and who, according to David, was in fact responsible for much of the Enlightenment discourse on freedom and equality. And, you know, tell us about Kandiarank. Why is he so important?
And actually, David's not the first to say it. I mean, there are indigenous historians like George Suey, who's a Canadian historian himself of Wendat heritage, who've been writing about this stuff for years. But I think it's quite telling what does and doesn't get airtime in the academy. So in a way, in these parts of the book, really, we're standing on the shoulders of other scholars whose work perhaps hasn't been given the attention it deserves. So this is us delving down into exactly that business of what is the origins of the question, the origins of social inequality. And actually, if you look at what Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau actually said themselves about where they got their ideas about freedom and equality, they themselves often point to the Americas, and particularly to the eastern woodlands region of North America. Now, there is a problem here, and it's basically a problem of historiography. So most modern historians of ideas say no, they dismiss this. It can't possibly be true that indigenous thinkers and indigenous societies had such great impact on European thought. in the 18th century. So there's a debate here to be had. Basically, what we have are these travelers' accounts and missionary relations, and they often include these lengthy dialogues with what's usually referred to by the European author as some sort of wise savage. And in fact, those dialogues do revolve precisely around ideas that became central to Enlightenment thought. Political freedoms, religious freedoms. But it's always assumed these days that the so-called savage is a fabrication of the European author, kind of sock puppet, who the European has made up in order to express opinions that might get him into trouble about deism or sexual mores or marriage or whatever it may be. So they put them in the mouth of this exotic other figure. And it's important to stress just how popular these dialogues were in Europe at the time. I mean, they were translated into every language you can think of. There were these endless theatrical productions that ran as long as Cats and Les Miserables, dramatizing the content. But as I mentioned, what's intriguing is that other modern scholars, including indigenous scholars, have gone back to the same early colonial sources and reached very different conclusions. So not only in some cases was the so-called savage interlocutor a real person, but we can actually even identify who it was. And Kandiaronk, who you mentioned, is really the key figure here. He's a 17th century Wendat statesman. He was famous in that region of the Great Lakes in what's today Canada as a brilliant orator and a debater. He was also a very seasoned warrior, and he was one of the key figures, one of the signatories in the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701. Anyway, we have various accounts that corroborate that in the late 17th century, he was very frequently invited as a kind of honored guest to the table of the then governor of that part of what the Europeans called New France, a man called Frontenac, who also fancied himself as a bit of a debater. And it's clear that they had a sort of proto-Enlightenment salon going there, where Kandiaronk would be invited to play the role of the rational skeptic, sort of peering in at all the peculiarities of French society. Now remember, this is the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King. There are lots of peculiar things for him to comment on and disparage and critique. So he really lays in particular, he lays into the French and the Europeans for their constant sort of groveling and obsequiousness, you know, deference and hierarchy, and you care so much about ranks, the obsession with money, but particularly also just the lack of generosity. The fact that, you know, European cities are riddled with hungry and homeless people. All these things seem to have been quite alien to indigenous societies at that time in that region. And it's through the writings of another Frenchman, the Baron La Hontan, who was a close associate of Kandiaronk and of the French governor at that time. He was fluent in Algonquian and Wendat languages, and he documents these conversations. Cut a long story short, he puts books out there right at the opening of the 18th century, and they become bestsellers. They spread like wildfire, these curious dialogues with a savage who has traveled. And every major Enlightenment writer, Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, they all do imitations. So they'll switch, you know, sometimes it's a half Huron or a Tahitian or a Persian, Peruvian, but the words and the contents and the sentiments are still, in essence, Kandiaronk. And the most important one for us was Madame Graffini's Letters of a Peruvian Woman. It's published right in the middle of the 18th century, where she puts the indigenous critique of European society into the mouth of an Inca princess called Zelia. And she shows a draft to her friend, much like David showed a draft to you of our book. But the friend in this case is Anne-Robert Turgot, who is really the inventor of our modern notion of social evolution. And he doesn't react very well. He says, yes, you know, freedom, equality, it's all very admirable. You know, we couldn't possibly be against these sort of things, but isn't this just a bit dangerous? You know, it's a little bit subversive. And maybe, Turgot suggests, maybe the reason that indigenous Americans have these freedoms, it's not because they're superior, it's because they're inferior. And by that he meant in particular technologically inferior in terms of material progress. And within a few years, he's written up what become his hugely influential works on universal history, where he presents for the first time social evolution as we still know it today. The whole of humanity divided up and classified according to modes of livelihood: hunters and gatherers, farmers, and eventually urban commercial civilization. And crucially, egalitarian societies are shoved down to the bottom rung of this new evolutionary ladder. In other words, what we now think of as social evolution was first proposed as a direct reaction, a direct counter-response to the indigenous critique of European society. That's where Kandiaronk is so fundamental to the story we tell.
Yeah, fascinating. Let's go to some of the reinterpretation of the archaeological record, which is you basically have the anthropological eye, the lens of an anthropologist, looking back at the archaeological record and reinterpreting this kind of evolutionary narrative. And you're making these like startling revelations all along the way. I mean, there's many highlights, and there's no way we're going to be able to cover everything today. But let's talk about a few. Yeah, let's give our listeners, let's give a flavor of what lies ahead. And the first thing I think is to turn to this idea of seasonal variations of social structures. It's an old insight from anthropology. You draw on Marcel Mauss and Henry Bouchard's seasonal variations of the Eskimo, and you basically apply it to the Paleolithic and other ages to show how human beings have been self-consciously experimenting with different social possibilities. The same communities, going from hierarchical to egalitarian societies. I mean, there's others that have done the same. Edmund Leach's political systems of Highland Burma, which Gumsao Gumlao, you don't cite that, but tell us more. Tell us more. Why is this oscillation that anthropologists have long drawn attention to so important to how we think about the archaeology?
Okay, yes. So this happened right at the beginning of our project, actually, when I was giving that lecture for the Royal Anthropological Society Institute, rather. And it was one of the first things that really alerted us that we just need to break out of this Turgot trap, this trap that Turgot and Rousseau sort of laid for us, where, it's just kind of assumed that before the invention of agriculture, people were somehow devoid of political imagination, they're just kind of adapting to their environments or something. And it's still perfectly common for people with full academic credentials to say this sort of thing, or say that, well, all hunter-gatherers can be divided into perhaps 2 or 3 basic types. But it's really beginning to look hopelessly reductionist. So just to give you a flavor of some of this material that we present in the book, we have, for example, in Ice Age Europe, these individuals who are buried like kings and queens, just absolutely suffused with regalia and material wealth. This is 30,000 years ago, at a time when there's really no evidence for monarchy or states or anything like that. So what's going on there? In the Americas, we've got these massive public arenas where hunter-gatherers gathered in their thousands, like Poverty Point, the site known as Poverty Point in Louisiana, about 3,500 years ago. So what's that all about? In the Middle East, we've got Göbekli Tepe, where 10,000 years ago, there are non-agricultural hunter-gatherer societies erecting these massive stone temples, apparently on a seasonal basis. And we also have ethno-historical accounts in the Americas on the West Coast of societies adopting slavery and then abolishing it. And these are societies that have never practiced agriculture at any point in their known histories. So the whole idea that hunting and gathering is a single mode of production with a handful of characteristics is just starting to look really redundant. So how to explain these things that we're seeing? And this is where the seasonal variations that you mentioned come in. many societies across the world, many of them hunter-gatherers, not all of them by any means, as you say, have alternated seasonally between entirely different social, political, legal, ethical systems. Often this follows patterns of aggregation, physical aggregation of people, and then dispersal linked to things like the migration of game or fish runs or annual nut harvests, whatever it may be. And the key thing here is that they apply the same logic to their political system. So, for example, with groups like the Inuit or the Plains Indians of North America, you could be living for part of the year in a society with strict rules governing the distribution of property and ownership, a society with chiefs who have real powers of command and coercion. But then the same society would flip up to a completely different set of ethical and political principles. So suddenly goods are shared out in a more communal manner, chiefs lose their coercive power and have to rely on persuading people and diplomacy. Actually, Claude Lévi-Strauss was probably the last person to write seriously about this kind of issue in relation to the Nambiquara of the Mato Grosso in the Amazon rainforest. And then it kind of dropped out of people's thinking. But if you look at the sort of modern archaeological evidence we have today, how people were living in pre-agricultural times, this is exactly what you find is this kind of cornucopia, almost sort of encyclopedia of social possibilities. It's about as far away as you can possibly imagine from the sort of drab idea that everyone is living all the time in egalitarian bands of hunter-gatherers.
Yeah, you also have this, apart from societies moving seasonally and varying social structures seasonally, you've also got these examples, wonderful examples of societies who are based on the same kind of mode of production, if you like. You know, you use that language in order to critique it, or the same kind of livelihood, who are actually have got completely different social structures living right side by side, right?
Right, side by side, yeah. Well,
tell us about the North American examples, yeah, the fisher foragers.
I know what you have in mind, which is really the history of indigenous peoples along the west coast of North America, which traditionally are divided into what anthropologists call culture areas, or used to call culture areas, the Californian culture area and the culture area of the Northwest coast. And much as you say, it's been known for a very, very long time, over a century, that hunter-gatherer societies in both regions display profoundly different social and ethical characteristics. So the Northwest Coast ones are often compared to medieval feudal barons living in ranked households. They do keep actually hereditary, or did keep hundreds of years ago, hereditary slaves. There was a lot of raiding and warfare. And they throw these incredibly elaborate banquets, known in the anthropological literature as potlatch. Californians, their neighbors just to the south, are really quite the opposite. Being a leader is about being frugal. It's even reflected in the fact that people have to be particularly thin and work very hard and very publicly and show that they're hardworking. There have even been comparisons between Californian foragers and the kind of Protestant work ethic that's found in Europe in the run-up to capitalism. But the question was just almost never asked. We discovered to our astonishment how these two almost polar opposite kind of societies ended up living next to each other. What is the process by which that happens? And in one of the chapters of the book, we try and put together the anthropological evidence, oral histories, which are actually very rarely used, it seems, and the archaeological evidence to try and reconstruct some of this process. And what you find is that this is very self-conscious. And this brings us back also to the seasonality arguments. What we're seeing here are not complex hunter-gatherers, who are just slight variations on each other. We're seeing societies which are very consciously constructing their own futures and reconfiguring households and family relations in order to make sure that certain things do or do not happen. In this case, slavery, which basically falls away as you transition from the Northwest Coast cultural zone, there's a book by a historian called Leland Donald called Aboriginal Slavery on the Northwest Coast, where he documents with great statistical rigor the rates of slavery and that sort of thing. And it just drops off as you get into California. And we go into some of the processes by which this took place. But it's kind of essentially the same point with seasonality, that, you know, if you're stepping into and out of one kind of social skin, if you like, at another time of year, you can also reflect back on that other kind of society, or even imagine what it might be to live all the time in a society with powerful leaders and kings and queens, and then choose not to do that, or to confine those things to ritual seasons, which is actually something we find on the Northwest Coast as well. And this was really a sort of major realization in the early stages of writing The Dawn of Everything, is just how much that potential for self-conscious transformation has been written out. It's been taken out of the way we write about human prehistory, and often in the same breath, how Europeans write about non-European peoples in general. So just learning to recognize the ways in which people we've been taught to think of as sort of childlike or just adapting to their environment were politically creative, actually in ways that we would find very difficult to emulate.
You have this the Rousseauian myth, which we often think about Rousseau and the noble savage, but you talk about Rousseau and the myth of the stupid savage, you know, because
exactly.
So,
I mean, it means once you make this step, you know, it means you can do away with all those silly old questions about Hobbes and Rousseau and are humans innately this or innately that? Are we egalitarian? Are we really hierarchical? Are we really altruistic or competitive? No, I mean, actually what makes us sapiens is exactly our ability to navigate between these kinds of possibilities. And this changes the nature of the question, doesn't it? So we're no longer asking, you know, if humans for most of our history were moving between different social arrangements, putting up hierarchies, taking them down, doing it again, then the real question can't be, what are the origins of social inequality? The real question is, how do we get stuck?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to come back to that, but I think there's a couple of other issues which are just so brilliant in the book, which would be great to talk about a little bit. One is the issue of scale. You know, you make us completely rethink scale. If for ages we've been thinking about, you know, hunter-gatherers living in these small scale groups, and then the various technological advances making the world a place in which we are much more connected on larger and larger scales, you're actually in the book making the opposite argument, right? That in fact, as populations have got larger, most people are living their lives on an ever smaller scale.
In social terms, that's right.
Right, yes.
Social worlds contract. That's right. And actually, people who have read the book so far, this seems to be one of their favorite bits, is basically where we pick apart all these myths about scale. I mean, I guess the basic idea in much of the existing literature is that here we are, wandering around in this modern, very complex world, but still between our ears is this evolved hunter-gatherer brain, which isn't really wired for it. So we need all these props and scaffolding and all these institutional hierarchies. We need politicians, we need bureaucrats, we need judges and enforcers, just to keep it all together, just to stop everything getting overloaded and just sort of sinking into chaos. But of course, the key thing there is, what do you mean by a hunter-gatherer brain? And actually, if you look at the latest studies in Journal of Human Evolution, the latest demographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers, it's actually really fascinating. What they conclude is that actually these groups do not live in small-scale societies at all. We're talking here about groups like the Matu in Australian Western Desert or Tanzanian Hadza. Actually, what they find is that people living in these societies maintain close relations or potential relations way beyond their immediate circle of family, often even beyond their language group. So we're talking about people who potentially you could marry, people who you would be obliged to offer hospitality to if they came along from one day from far away. This may not happen in practice, but the key point in evolutionary terms is that members of these ostensibly very small societies are also holding in their minds an image of a vastly larger social network. And the archaeology really bears this out, because actually what you find before cities in the archaeological record are not these isolated pockets of human beings, but these grand sort of coalitions of societies that often span whole continents, and they're held together exactly by these norms of ritual hospitality. So when cities do eventually begin to appear in various parts of the world from around 5,000 years ago, it almost looks more like a process of contraction than expansion. It's like one of these grand regional confederacies or coalitions getting concentrated in a single spot or a few spots. There's certainly no great sort of psychological rupture that might suddenly oblige people to give up all their social freedoms and appoint great leaders. And actually, that's exactly what you find when you look directly now at the evidence, and there's so much new evidence just over the last 20 or 30 years for what the first cities in the world on various different continents were actually like. This is what you find. It's not uniform. Some of them are incredibly hierarchical, but a surprising number of others are not. Actually, it's
amazing. You know, you take us to these cities in Mesopotamia, in the Ukraine, in China, and what you show us is these egalitarian cities, and you're like, wait, what? You know, how is that possible, David? Egalitarian cities.
Well, that's a great example of how we work together. You know, in this particular case, it was David just posing the question to me. So, are there any anything like an egalitarian city in the history, in the archaeological record? And I started telling him about these settlements north of the Black Sea in what today is Ukraine and Moldova, which are astonishing. They look like these great sort of circles, sort of tree rings of houses, all roughly the same size. They're massive. They started about 5,000 years ago, so they're as old as the first cities in Mesopotamia. They're roughly the same size in terms of total area. There's lots of arguments, as you can imagine, exactly how many thousands of people lived in them, but even conservative estimates, we're talking about probably tens of thousands of people. But there's simply no evidence for monarchy or public buildings or central storage or administration, or even just marked inequalities of wealth. So he said, oh, well, that'll do. And I said, yeah, but nobody calls them cities. Well, why don't they call them cities? I said, well, because there's no public buildings or monarchies or central government. I mean, it's an entirely logically circular thing that, one assumes that the nature of a city is to be hierarchical. Therefore, even if you get a settlement the size of a city that isn't hierarchical, you can't call it a city. So, it's a classic example of bad reasoning. So we just call them cities, basically, and then adduce other examples, particularly from the Americas, but also South Asia. The early Harappan civilization of Pakistan and the Indus Valley is very interesting in this respect. So yeah, I mean, we won't have time to go into it all now.
But yeah, we're ranging all over the world. You're bringing Mohenjo-daro at that point too,
Mm-hmm.
don't you? But let's move on to gender. Gender, you make these remarkable revelations about gender too. The Bronze Age was supposed to bring about patriarchy, but you show us extraordinary possibilities, lots of things happening. Neolithic matriarchies, worshipping farmers.
We don't make the case actually for Neolithic matriarchies. It's funny how this is very interesting, because people often say there was an archaeologist called Maria Gimbutas.
Yes.
Who it's often claimed made the argument that Neolithic societies were matriarchal. Actually, she never did. She was very careful to say that they weren't actually matriarchal. She basically just argued that in the Neolithic societies she knew best, and she was really a world expert on the Balkan region and the later prehistory of the Balkan region, that women had autonomy from men and a certain priority in the ritual sphere. It's very interesting what happened to her work and her reputation, largely after she passed away in the 1990s. I guess she was sort of vilified for even raising the topic of, what was women's status in the household in Neolithic times. This is a real problem for us because, as you've inferred, the question, how did we get stuck? The answer is not agriculture. We won't go into that now, I expect, but that's not why we got stuck. We spend a couple of chapters explaining that's not the reason. It's not cities. It's not as if these big seasonal agglomerations suddenly got fixed into cities, and these are all silly, simple stories. But we're interested in what human beings actually got up to, which invariably it's more complicated, but a lot more interesting. But gender relations are actually pretty fundamental to this question of how we got stuck in hierarchical patterns of authority that we see today. It can't be purely coincidental that virtually all of the ancient kingdoms and empires that we know of up until modern times have taken the patriarchal household as their basic political model of governance. So the king is the father of his people, king rules the land much as he manages his domestic estate. The question is, how and when did that happen? But partly because the whole issue of gender in prehistory has become so loaded, almost taboo in some ways, it's very, very difficult to get scholars to engage in that conversation. The fact is, if you actually look at the latest research, some of the best research from the region that Gimbutas was familiar with comes from a site called Çatalhöyük in central Turkey. Actually, what they found out is that men and women do seem to have enjoyed fairly equal treatment in terms of things like diet and health. Some of the art focuses on female elders. Women are very visible in the ritual sphere, not to the exclusion of men, but not encompassed by men either. Now, that's not to say we're dealing with a matriarchal society, but it doesn't look much like a patriarchal society either. And, as you say, as for the question of whether women's freedoms sort of inevitably eroded with the rise of cities and states, yes, clearly at times that happened. Actually, David wrote a lot about it in his book on debt, but it certainly wasn't universal. The problem seems to be, and this is something we go into at various points in the book, is that the way history is written seems almost designed to make periods of women's freedom or relative freedom invisible. I could give you examples if you like.
Yeah. No, thanks, David. So what's wonderful about the book is, you've shown us that there's infinitely more possibilities for how we've lived in the world, that people were, self-consciously thinking about their social structures and making them and creating them, and we were moving between different forms. But somewhere along the way, right, as you say, things did go wrong. We can't swap and change anymore in the same way that we might have in the past. Perhaps only the wealthy can alternate between being, living seasonally and having different social structures seasonally. So where have things gone wrong? What did go wrong? Maybe we can come to some of those arguments.
Well, this is not a simple argument, but the other major element, I would say, aside from gender, is violence. First of all, we just have to rule out the sort of Hobbesian premise that prehistoric societies were innately or perennially violent. There's actually very good statistical evidence for things like violent death rates and injury rates on Paleolithic skeletons, and it just doesn't hold up. Even in later periods, yes, you get periods of intense intergroup warfare, but then you get long periods of peace. So, the warfare competition, it's no more deeply rooted in evolutionary terms than the opposite. It's deeply rooted and no more less. Now, this raises the question of why it is that in some cases, violence does have lasting, durable effects, structural effects on societies, and why in other cases it doesn't so much. And what seemed really important to us here, another kind of pattern that emerged out of our research, is that this has a lot to do with when systems of violence get mixed up with what you might call systems of care. I know that sounds a bit abstract, but just to give you one brief example, there's a whole series of unrelated cases from Shang China to early dynastic Egypt, Mesoamerica, where the appearance of monarchies for the first time is associated with these rituals. You know, the ones Maurice Bloch is slightly obsessed by, where you have extraordinary amounts of violence, literally hundreds of non-royal people being killed and buried around a royal tomb. It's all part of a big ritual performance, and the ultimate aim of the performance is actually to care for someone. It's to care for the deceased king, to beautify him or her in death, make her into an ancestor. And interestingly, these kind of mass killings nearly always seem to take place at the point where monarchies come into being, and then they taper off. But somehow they seem crucial to that initial rupture where ritual chiefs, or play kings, as David liked to call them, stop being play kings and they obtain real sovereignty over the living. And we have lots of other discussions and examples in the book about how that particular nexus between violence and care leads to the loss of basically social freedoms, which are otherwise quite widespread and taken for granted in many human societies.
Yeah, and I guess one of the points you really draw out in the book is this is nothing to do with like modes of the political economy, nothing to do with modes of production, nothing to do with livelihoods. And so I guess one of the obvious questions is, you know, what about capitalism? I mean, you know, which is, have we, you know, can we create all of these different social structures under you know, much more egalitarian models under capitalism? You know,
it depends what you mean by capitalism. You know, as you know better than I do, David made, I think, a very persuasive argument that we're not in capitalism at the moment. We're in something that he called managerial feudalism. So we have to be clear what we're arguing about, you know, when we say capitalism.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's one we can take up later, perhaps. But let's move to freedoms. You know, you because I think you really make some really interesting, very, very. One of the things you read the book and then you realize actually, you know, what you're reading about, what you're setting up is another way for us, a project of freedom, a kind of a way for us to think about freedom, and why actually the central questions we should be asking are not to do with inequality and equality, but to do with freedom. And you make us rethink what this freedom is and what freedom ought to be, right? And it would be really great to hear.
It's interesting because a lot of societies that have been described as egalitarian, including Kandiaronk's own society in the Eastern Woodlands, were not egalitarian in that material sense. In fact, they don't seem to have cared that much about if anyone's got more stuff than anyone else. What really seemed to matter, what really comes across in that, going back to that indigenous critique, is freedoms, personal autonomy, including women's freedoms. And we really have to go back, I think, to those points and look at the implications. I mean, it really struck us that something strange has happened, in the sense that no serious person in our fields of archaeology and anthropology would be caught today saying, I believe that, you know, all human societies have evolved through these stages, from bands to tribes and chiefdoms and states and whatever. But at the same time, almost everyone continues using the terms, you know, with scare quotes, and anyone outside those disciplines still more or less assumes that that is the default story of human social evolution. And we felt that one of the reasons for this is simply because there is no other conceptual framework which is as kind of encompassing and as elegant, frankly, as that one, except that it's completely wrong. So in the book, we do try to lay some foundations, not in a dogmatic way. This is the beginning of a process. And actually, this does take us back to Candiaronc. I mean, you could imagine Candiaronc and Rousseau maybe agreeing on the virtues of freedom and personal autonomy, but only Candiaronc would have actually had any clue what it means in practice to live in a society where most people have not been trained into obedience the way that we all have. As David used to joke, the closest that Jean-Jacques Rousseau ever got to a society of equals was probably someone giving out equal slices of cake at a dinner party. So if we want to understand, back to your question, what's been lost, what's gone wrong in societies today, then it does seem instructive to look at those basic freedoms that societies like the Wendat, but also many others, seem to have taken for granted. And we identified three elementary freedoms which we suggest were once common to much of humanity. Now, in the next 2 minutes, I could attempt to tell you what they are.
You have to, David. Yeah, and we will
so
end
the first freedom is the freedom to move away from one's social surroundings, escape one's social surroundings, knowing that you will be welcomed and valued in another place. This is what underpins those great coalitions, those great prehistoric coalitions of societies that I was talking about. Second freedom, to disobey arbitrary commands, knowing that you will not be ostracized, but attended to, listened, debated. This is what underpinned the kind of deliberative politics of Native American societies that so impressed European thinkers at the time of the Enlightenment. And the third freedom is the freedom to create entirely new and different forms of society, or move between alternatives, as with those seasonal variations that I talked about, but of course not just that, many other things as well. So those are the basic freedoms. We have basic forms of domination too, but I don't think we're going to have time to go into them.
No, I think this hopeful note about freedom and your redefinition of freedoms, and I know you're drawing on a long history of thinking about this, but yes, is a wonderful place for us to hand back to Chico to maybe take us and open up the Q&A. I'm sure people are really waiting to ask questions, and so thank you so much, David. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Alpa. Enjoyed it.
Yes, no, thank you both. And indeed, there are a number of questions already here. Maybe we can come back to the taxonomy of forms of domination a little bit later. But let me, I actually had some questions of my own, but there are so many great questions here that let me just launch straight to them. Is it all right with you, David, if I group them into groups of 2?
As long as Alpa promises to help me answer them.
Okay. I won't do 3, but I'll do 2. And then maybe you can start and then Alpa can comment as well. Before I start with the questions, let me just acknowledge here that Andrea Mordaunt, who's a social policy alumna and also worked at Occupy, reminds us that it's the 10th anniversary of the Occupy movement on Friday, the 15th, and applauds any recognition of David Graeber and his work, since he was a supporter. Now, that was not a question, that was just something I wanted to acknowledge. Let me start with some questions here. There's one from Gabriela Cabana, who's a PhD student at the anthropology department here. She says, could you comment more on the historical emergence of relations of domination in the most intimate spaces, and even in relations of care? It's hard to interpret something so subtle from archaeological remains, she says, but surely it's a direction to explore more in dialogue with social anthropology. So that's one. And then the next one in this batch is from Rose Pravda, who says, Rose, just a worker of the world. Do you talk about stories, discourses about the origins or meaning of civilization from those historical civilizational cores or their neighbors? Do these stories, discourses have anything interesting to say about the relationship between humans and animals? Okay, so with those, over to you, David.
Thank you, I think. Yes, Gabi's question about relations of domination within the household, we felt that a particularly important thinker in this respect was the mid-20th century social anthropologist Franz Steiner, who is a rather overlooked figure. We talk about him in the conclusion to the book, but he wrote an immense thesis. Actually, I have a printout of it up here on my shelf, about what he called pre-servile institutions, pre-servile institutions. And he was exactly interested in this question of how hierarchy takes root in the household. So this is not an archaeological treatise. In fact, there's very little archaeological evidence to speak of when he wrote it. But the kind of questions he raised, and he himself was made a refugee from Central Europe, so he knew what he was talking about when he drew particular attention to effectively what happens when the first of our freedoms, the freedom to move away and be welcomed somewhere else, when that breaks down. What happens when these norms of hospitality and asylum collapse? And how is that so often a stepping stone towards forms of domination within societies? And he produced an extraordinary range of examples from different cultures, different points of history, to elaborate on that fact, which he felt was fundamental. But I completely agree with the nature of the question. It's exactly the kind of area that could shed light on some things like the roots of patriarchy, and really deserves a lot more focused research. So we do have a fair bit more on it in the book, but it's certainly one of the points that we would have developed a great deal. And hopefully other people will take that up. Oh, the other question, well, civilization. Yeah, one of my favorite topics. I actually, one of the ways David and I started working together is that he read a very genuinely small book that I wrote called What Makes Civilization, which is about the ancient Middle East, Egypt and Mesopotamia, and the whole concept of civilization. And we do have a bit of an aside on this in The Dawn of Everything, where we basically argue that there's something fundamentally weird about our concept of civilization, which on the one hand is supposed to mean being civil and sort of being polite and being congenial to each other. But when you look at the things that people call civilizations in history, they're often exactly the opposite. They're, brutal sort of slaveholding societies, empires, the ancient Romans, Han China, monuments everywhere. These are meant to be civilizations. So there's something strange and paradoxical about that. And actually, other anthropologists like Marcel Mauss, who was a great inspiration to David and myself, tried to change the use of the term civilization so that instead of referring to these societies that are held together by military means, effectively by coercion, we should talk instead about those great coalitions, those voluntary coalitions that hold people together over enormous areas through things like hospitality and feeding each other and caring for each other. Why not call those civilizations? Mauss argued in part, which is also a point about gender, because very often the things that the people who are responsible for all of that hospitality are women. Whereas the people responsible for all the great stone monuments proclaiming how great they are historically have tended to be men, often appropriating the intellectual achievements of women. So the whole concept of civilization, I would have thought at this point, it's probably not going to go away. It keeps getting reinvented in myriad ways, but I think we can probably do better than we currently do in defining it. I'm sorry, I haven't got to the point about humans and animals, but I could do, unless you want to move on to another question. Or unless there's another question that touches on human-animal relations.
Let me ask you another couple of questions, and then maybe either you or Alpa can go back to the humans and animals. But here are two that I'm quite curious about. One from Serdar Erdin from Glasgow. How does David see the current decolonization of curriculum movement? Some critics pointed out that this movement is still Eurocentric and lacks local context too. Can this movement broaden our perspective on history and the concept of the West? That's one. The other one, which I quite like, is a very short question. Any examples from Africa?
Examples of?
I mean, you spoke of many things from many places, but nothing seemed to have been from Africa, I think, is what's motivating the question.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. We focus in this book on the Americas, and particularly for those reasons that I've emphasized. It became, in ways that we hadn't anticipated, a book with a focus on that particular encounter with indigenous peoples of the Americas, and then reading that back into the archaeological evidence from other parts of the world, including Africa. So we have extensive sections on ancient Egypt, for example, but I'm aware, actually that's where most of my fieldwork and research is, and David was also an Africanist. He was a specialist in the anthropology of Madagascar. There are innumerable other examples from the sub-Saharan region where one could explore all of these concepts. And what we'd hope to do is exactly that. Write more books, write a number of sequels, at least 3, and adduce more examples. Decolonization is something that I see up close. It's happening on my own campus, at my own institute. I see it as something basic and fundamental, particularly to the disciplines that David and I belong to. Archaeology and anthropology are completely rooted in the history of colonialism and colonial thought, as I think will be very apparent from all of the material that I've discussed. You know, the idea that indigenous peoples who are still with us have nothing much to tell us except about some remote epoch in human prehistory is itself a direct outcome of colonial mindsets and colonialism. The idea that their systems of property, actually this brings us back to human-animal relations, the idea that their systems of property and land management have nothing to teach us is itself also a direct product of the thinking of people like John Locke. Back in the 17th century, the agricultural argument that if you don't cultivate wheat and mix your hands in the soil the same way that we do, somehow you have no curatorship of that territory. Whereas in fact, there's probably an enormous amount that we could learn from other ways of owning and caring for land and resources. One example that we go into in the book, which touches exactly on this issue of human relations to the non-human world, are societies that have sometimes been described as totemic in the anthropological literature, particularly in North America and also Australia, where a group owns its totem, but the implication of that is precisely different from our notion of ownership and our notion of what it means to have full ownership, which is very much rooted in the Roman tradition and Roman law, something that Orlando Patterson, the Jamaican sociologist, wrote extensively about, where full ownership in the European legal sense is the right of abusus, I think is the Latin term, which is exactly what it sounds like, abuse. It's the right to commoditize, buy, sell, turn someone or something into property. I mean, these are traditions rooted in slave law, as Patterson argues. Whereas in these totemic systems, ownership has exactly the opposite connotation. A clan owns its totem, which is usually an animal species. And what that means is precisely that they can't hunt it and eat it and kill it. They have to nurture it. They have to create an environment in which it can thrive and reproduce. So concepts of ownership that are actually based on caretaking as opposed to extraction have worked, as we can see now archaeologically as well, not just in primitive small-scale societies, but actually on really impressive scales, large demographic scales prior to the colonial era. It's colonialism and the effects of genocide, pandemics, epidemics, that really warps our picture of what these societies were actually like. But we can now begin to correct that picture. So decolonizing the curriculum is simply a matter of good science. You know, it's a matter of getting the facts right.
One of the interesting things, can you hear me? I'm just interjecting here. One of the interesting things that we've talked about, David, about decolonization and this book is how, you know, so many of the arguments you're making, right, are about, let's look at what Indigenous societies were actually like. Well, let's look at what Indigenous scholars are saying. Let's, you know, you instead of Rousseau and Hobbes, you make us focus on Kandiarank and what he has to say. And throughout the book, there are these people who have been marginalized in various ways. Maria Gimbutas, Franz Steiner. You know, you're drawing our attention to these people who had some really interesting things to say about human history, and who've been forgotten or sidelined, and you're centering them. But one of the things that we've talked about, David, which is so, you know, is so fascinating in relation to this question of decolonization, is it takes two white men to write a book like this, you know, to make those voices heard. So there's some kind of ironies in how this whole thing, you know, decolonizing the curriculum works.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we talk about in near the beginning of the book. You know, the prevailing view that Western philosophy couldn't possibly have been influenced to that extent by Indigenous intellectuals. And therefore that it's strange, it's almost like a kind of inverse racism, you know, this idea that Europeans must have made it all up. Anything and everything that's attributed to an Indigenous thinker or an Indigenous intellectual must be a fabrication or a fantasy, because how could people who were engaged in genocide possibly have been listening to people they were effectively wiping out or colluding in wiping them out? But the effect is almost a sort of arrogant assumption that European or Western systems of thought are somehow so impervious to outside influences. Do you see what I mean? So it ends up, although, you know, these are well-intentioned points against the romanticization of non-European peoples, turning people into noble savages or whatever it may be, they end up almost doing the reverse and creating this illusion of European philosophy, European science as this kind of hermetically sealed thing. So really what we're dealing with in the book is the business as we see it, as you say, being who we are, of trying to undo some of the conceptual damage that's been done by writing out those debts that what we regard as Western civilization owes to other people and other traditions. That's where we've focused our work, drawing on a whole range of scholars, some of Indigenous descent, some not.
Much through dialogue as well. There's a question about dialogue, but yes, yeah.
Yes, let's get to some of those other questions. So here's one, got a lot of likes. It is, although the context is, of course, overtly authoritarian, would you consider that the world slipping into lockdowns post-COVID to be a modern instance of dramatically changing or shifting entire social structures? In the sense that even if even authoritarians can enact such changes today, doing so in more democratic ways is not actually that unrealistic in the face of COVID. That's a COVID and modern examples of your seasonal changes in social structure. The second one is from Yash Lad, the one I just read. The one from George Turner here. There's a slight paradox or bittersweetness in coming to understand the scope of human possibilities. Whilst deconstructing the myths of impossibility can be empowering and hopeful, it can also leave us feeling disappointed that we have not and may never come to realize these possibilities. Myths, he says, can be profoundly comforting in allowing us to dismiss our lack of freedom as inevitable. because it absolves us of responsibility. So with these myths destroyed, how do we cultivate and nurture collective comfort despite our pointless, unnecessary, and wasteful unfreedom? So it sounds like your book will throw people into depression and despair by destroying those myths. So how do you avoid that? By cultivating and nurturing?
Yeah, we've already had a bit of that. You know, we wrote essays and also scholarly papers for scholarly journals over the years that we were preparing the book. So we already sort of had a flavor of this. Actually, it's usually other academics. It's not other readers of our work who seem quite uplifted by what we're saying quite often, but a lot of academics seem to get depressed. It's like, well, you've taken away our myth, you know, you've taken away our nice, simple story, and it's annoying, and you haven't given us another one. But you know, that's the whole point. We're not in the business of making up fairy tales. We're archaeologists and anthropologists trying to understand this, you know, very complex and hard to interpret record of scientific evidence. It is, you know, the fact that you can summarize what you might call the old story of the origins of inequality in about 2 sentences is about as clear an indication as you could hope for that we are in the realm of myth, in the realm of fables and fairy tales. No sensible account of the broad sweep of human history is going to fit into a tweet, but the old one does. So that's a bit of a giveaway. So I think you know, there's a debate to be had there about the place of myth. I don't think myth itself is the problem. All societies have them, just as all societies have their own versions of science. But the kind of myths that we've been relying on for 2.5 centuries now, I think are first of all terribly boring. You know, just seeing them again and again and again, and particularly at this time when I think any sane person can see that as a species we face some very serious challenges, and those are challenges precisely about what we call the third freedom. You know, can we actually remake our societies in some structurally significantly different form that could potentially make a difference to something like the Earth system or rates of global poverty? Sorry, how did I get onto this? Oh yeah, well, if you keep telling yourself a myth, a fable, a story about human history that basically drums into your head that the forces of history and evolution are against you, that everything we have now is somehow preordained or inevitable, the kind of teleological logic of the rational skeptic that Alpa was talking about right at the beginning of our chat, is not helpful, and it's also not true. So I think it is time probably to abandon some of these very shop-worn myths, stop this kind of Hobbes Rousseau back and forth, and actually look again at the evidence which is there.
David, that's great. Let me interrupt you there before we get back to the COVID question, just because this is the perfect sort of segue into the question that I had wanted to ask you, which is that in the beginning of the book, you sort of very effectively destroy the dichotomy of Hobbes and Rousseau and the noble savage and the nasty and British in short. But then one of the arguments against it is you say they have dire political implications. And so now when you're answering this question, you say, we've taken away our myths and you haven't given us another one. And yet, is it true that you haven't given us another one? Because it seems very clear that you did want to have a political implication with your book that wasn't dire. So that's part A of the question. What is the political implication that isn't dire? And the second one is, if it is the possibility that we can create this new forms of society because there is no preordained, predetermined trajectory from either the fall from Rousseau or the rise from Hobbes, then on the other hand, you lay out quite clearly, they say, well, these societies weren't good or bad, they were human. Much like human, there's a little bit of everything. There's going to be some selfishness, some love of equity, some preference for equity, some order, some chaos. But if that's the case, then by what, a simple-minded economist like me would call the law of large numbers, that is, we've been trying this for millennia, right? What is there to suggest that we would be able to overcome the bad parts? What is there to suggest? Perhaps it's climate change. Perhaps it's being faced by the demise of the world. But what is there to suggest that we can actually bring ourselves together in ways that we have never done before to create a utopia?
Well, first of all, I don't personally think utopia is the point. The point is precisely that we're not talking about utopias. If you start with a myth and a completely fantastic notion of, where human societies originate and how they develop, then all you can produce is utopias, because they're sort of built on sand, they're built on nothing. There's a reason the book is 700 pages long and copiously referenced. It's because we don't want to do that. We're serious about this stuff. And I'm just trying to understand your question properly, Chico. When you say we've been trying this for millennia, what is it you think we've been trying?
To order our social lives.
Yes. All right. I think for me, this would have to come back to the question about decolonization, because at least for the last few hundred years, I think there's been a very obvious, enormously well-documented effort on the part of some states and societies to do the opposite, to create disorder and to conquer and own. And the whole history of the last few centuries, I think, is quite difficult to interpret as an attempt to order society. It seems to have been about something else.
But wouldn't you say, as I really don't want to, because now I've abused my prerogative as chair, but just give me one moment of sort of push you a little bit on this. You might say that, the British were definitely trying to disorganize and create chaos in all their colonies, as were the French and many others, but perhaps they were trying to organize things at home, at least, and create something. Now, it may have been a mess, may have been a monarchy, there were parliaments, there was all sorts of things. Whether this is fully Western and entirely Western, I'm not sure. You guys would know much better than me, but it would seem to me that the Chinese empires from many centuries ago probably did the same. Or the Mongolian empires, or the Genghis Khan and others. They probably try to organize their own existences in some way, which might have been terrible or not. And they didn't really give a damn about anybody else and created chaos everywhere else.
The notion of order.
The Aztecs are reported to have done this to other peoples in the Mexican peninsula. And I suspect, the Malian Empire of old may have well done that to their neighbors. So to me, it just goes back, and I don't know that I fully believe what I'm about to say, but just for the sake of argument here, there's something about human nature that means we oscillate between this good and bad. It's almost like your seasonality that Alpa was mentioning. So yeah, just, is there something that's not a myth that can tell us we can do it really differently?
Well, the point of the book really is that the evidence of human history tells us precisely that. The kind of order that you seem to be talking about there is really order through violence, if I understand you correctly. This comes back to a question that is often put to me. Well, if you're right, and there's nothing inevitable about the trajectory that we find ourselves on these days, how is it that the world is covered from end to end with nation states, which are all in some way coercive and have these kind of extraordinary powers? Surely this must be somehow the result of thousands of years of human social evolution. Now, if you're a scientist or a historian, you're supposed to go for the simplest explanation, what scientists call the most parsimonious one. And the most parsimonious one that requires the fewest logical leaps is that the reason that much of the Earth, many of the countries and regions that you refer to, are covered with nation states that look a bit like European ones is because Europeans put them there, largely at the point of a gun. That's a pretty compelling explanation. It's a hell of a lot more complicated and difficult to try and explain it as the outcome of thousands of years of cultural evolution, going back to the agricultural revolution and the origin of cities. You get into all sorts of logical and factual difficulties, which we try to unpick in the book. And that in itself, I think, gives a different perspective on where we find ourselves, if that's at all helpful as an answer.
Yeah, but the Aztecs, they couldn't have been put there by the Europeans, could they?
Did I suggest they were?
Well, I just said the logical leap, the explanation that required the least logical leaps is that the Europeans put them there, which I can see in many, many cases. But
I don't follow the logic. The Aztec Triple Alliance was there before Europeans. There's no question about that.
Precisely. Yeah. Great. Well, we could continue, but we'll have to do that in the pub. Let me see if there's any one more chance for a question here. Yeah, let's get to the one that Alpa had also noted. So Scott Thompson asks, David, I guess he means Graeber here, always stressed the importance of dialogue. Great ideas emerge dialogically from the relations between people, as this book emerged from a prolonged conversation between the two Davids. How important is dialogue to the structure of the book and to a new history of mankind?
Thank you. It's a really interesting question. That's right. David liked this idea that I think is now quite sort of soundly demonstrated in neuroscience, that if you try and hold an idea in your head, your window of concentration is absolutely minute. But when you talk to somebody about it, our capacity to actually focus on a concept, unless you're some sort of highly trained individual like a guru or a yogi or something who can hold a thought for so long all by themselves, is a particular skill. But there's a reason, he pointed out, where so much ancient philosophy, not just in the European tradition, but in others, is presented in the form of dialogues. And I think, certainly the greatest privilege of my academic career to have this incredibly protracted dialogue with David Graeber, who was somebody who would have dialogues with absolutely anybody and treated everybody exactly the same. And I'm sure that was one of the sources of the richness of his own thinking. And I think it is, we do try in the book to reconstruct. I mean, the way the book's structured, which is slightly unorthodox, kind of reflects the evolution of that conversation over a very long time span. And of course, the whole idea of dialogue in the sense of qu'en dire and l'entendre, and how things emerge from that is terribly important as well. It's not something I thought much about before, but it probably is quite a central theme.
That's great. We're almost at the end of the time, unfortunately. There are lots more questions, about 26 open at the moment, which shows, we had 400 people at the peak here. A lot of interest in this great book. Just before we end, I wonder if Alpa, you'd like to sort of say a few words?
No, I just want to say thanks so much, David, for kicking off, setting afloat the book into the world, and it's going to have many lives and afterlives. And Chico, thank you so much for chairing the event. And I think, there's so much to your questions that we can take forward in further discussion. And it's just been such a privilege and a pleasure to be a part of this event. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alpa in particular, and Chico for the chance to do this. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, and let me just in conclusion thank everyone who attended, but particularly our speakers, Professor Alpa Shah and Professor David Wengrow in particular, one of the two authors of the book. It is a fascinating book. I haven't been able to read all of it yet, but the beginning is absolutely fascinating, and I will finish the book. It's an incredibly erudite and well-written and compelling piece of work. So I urge all of you to buy it. And with that, thank you very much indeed to all of you, and see you at our next event. Bye-bye.
Thank you.